Carlo. Let's have you over here, and Robert over there. And Harry, we'll have you here. That's it, that's it.
I bet you referred to as small c.
Just wait for Carlo. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our big debate. My name is Michael Skapinker. I'm assistant editor at the Financial Times and the editor of the Financial Times Special Report. We're going to be hearing from our panel today, so I will just first of all introduce them. Immediately next to me is Carlo Ratti. Carlo is an architect and an engineer by training. He practices and teaches around the world in Italy, at MIT in Boston, and in Singapore. He's, I say, an architect, engineer, as you will also hear today, a thinker on urban issues and our urban future. Next to Carlo is Harry Macklowe, who is one of New York's most important property developers. You will have seen his Apple glass cube, I'm sure, those of you who've been to Manhattan. And Harry is now responsible for what is going to be the tallest building in Manhattan. It's going to change the skyline on Park Lane. Next to Harry is Robert Booth, I'm sure known to many of you in property development, the Chief Executive Officer of Emaar Dubai Real Estate. And at the end is Graeme Maxton, who is an economist, a long-time journalist, and the author of the book, The End of Progress, How Modern Economics Has Failed Us. Now, it's quite an important time for MIPIM. This is its 25th anniversary. And 25 years ago was a very significant year. It takes us back to 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which completely reconfigured not just Europe, but the world. And we've had many changes since then. We've had the rise of the emerging economies of China, of Brazil, of India. We've had the rise of the environmental movement and our environmental consciousness and our thinking and worrying about what is happening to our climate and whether the extreme climate events that we've been seeing in recent years and recent decades are going to change the way we live in future. And we've also seen the rise of the empowered and very opinionated citizen. It's no longer the case that newspapers like the Financial Times have the field of commentary and news to ourselves. There are many competitors, and people, as we've seen, have used the new technologies, the social media, to effect enormous changes in government, in protest movements, and such like. And I think it's quite fitting that we should be sitting here today, because this week, yesterday in fact, has been designated the 25th birthday of the World Wide Web, which I think really brackets the period that we're talking about and the enormous changes that we've seen. Our first speaker, we're going to have a talk from Graeme, who is going to be talking about how modern economics has failed us, really, which I think is something that we're all ready to hear about. After that, we will have a discussion with our panel, and we will then open it up to you. So if I could begin with Graeme Maxton. Thank you, Graeme.
Thank you. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you this morning. I'm going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes and just try and kick off the discussion here. I'm going to talk about three things. I was asked to think about, if I was looking 5 to 25 years ahead, what are the issues that I would be most concerned about if I was in the property or real estate sector? And there are really three issues in the developed world. I'm only going to be talking about the developed world. I'm not going to talk about what's happening in Russia or China. Happy to discuss those afterwards. But I'm looking at the US, at Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, the countries that account for about 2/3 of the world economy. And there are three issues that, to me, stand out beyond any others. The first, on the top left there, is economic growth. We're a bit like that car in the film Thelma and Louise that's driven off the cliff. And we haven't actually hit the bottom yet, but we're going to see the implications of what's been going on economically over the next 10 or 15 years. The second issue is perhaps easier to guess, is climate change. If there was one issue which concerned me more than any other in the next 10 or 15 years, it is climate change. And the third one, the rather strange diagram at the bottom, is what I've called the new machine age. We've reached a stage in the last few years where our ability to computerize and to mechanize and to robotize different jobs has increased dramatically, and it will increase dramatically in the next 10 or 15 years. And that will change the sorts of jobs that most of us do, and it will change the sort of demand that we have for many buildings. Let me start, first of all, by talking about economics. This is a chart of the rate of economic growth in the US. And you can see it starts back in 1960 and goes through to beyond 2020. And the trend is very clear. The top shows the total economic growth, the bottom shows the economic growth per person, so to strip out the effects of population growth. And the long-term trend is downwards. Now, if I took the same chart for Europe, for Canada, for Australia, you'd see exactly the same pattern. A long, slow, downward trend in terms of economic growth. Now, that's perfectly reasonable and perfectly normal because these economies are mature. But you can see that the trend is going to continue. Now, I know that the price of property is not directly related to the rates of economic growth, certainly in the short to medium term. And it's not directly linked to supply and demand. I used to live in Hong Kong, so I know that the supply and demand can be completely different in terms of what it means for property prices. But over the long term, economic growth will drive the relationship between prices and what's available to sell. And the long-term trend is down. Now, let me just explain. There are four reasons why I think this trend will continue, why this long, slow rate of economic growth will continue. The first of those, starting the top left, is that the piggy bank is empty. Over the last 25 years, the growth in the developed world, the economic growth that we've seen, has not come from people earning more, from people becoming better off, from their standard of living increasing. It's come because they borrowed. Average incomes, certainly in Europe and the US and many other parts of the world, have not risen in the last 15 to 20 years. And certainly since 2007, they've gone down. And yet the rate of economic growth has continued to rise. We've had reasonably good economic growth. And that's because people have borrowed. They've borrowed on their credit cards, they've borrowed against their houses, they've borrowed against their cars, and they've borrowed against bank loans, and that's what's stimulated the economic growth. That's what's maintained the growth. And the reason we had the crash in 2007 was because the borrowing reached the limit of possibility. Consumers had borrowed too much in Europe, they'd borrowed too much in the US, and so we had the crisis. And since then, of course, we've seen massive bailouts by governments of banks, and indeed of many parts of the economy. And they've flooded these economies with cash, and that's what's maintained growth since 2007, 2008. So the entire developed world economy has been running on this debt cycle, and it's like that car that's driven over the cliff. It's not actually running on fundamentals. And because of the level of debt that still remains, that can't change, and so the growth that we saw at the beginning of the last 100 years cannot come back as it did before. The second reason is, on the top right, resources. We are not running out of resources, but we've certainly reached a barrier with a number of resources. If I think about oil, gold, silver, copper, zinc, we've reached a position where the demand is increasing faster than the supply. And because of that, the price for these items is going to continue rising and will rise steadily over the years ahead. And that means that there is less money to spend on consumption, which is what drives growth. So simply because the cost of one part of our budgets is going to rise, it means that we have to give up something somewhere else, and that means consumption will not be able to rise as rapidly. The third factor on the bottom right is aging populations. Now, we haven't really seen the effect of aging populations. We don't really understand this yet. We're beginning to see the effects in Japan. But today in Europe, 1 in 5 people is over the age of 65, and it'll soon be 1 in 4. Now, this is not true in the US. The US still has a lot of immigration, which is going to maintain, so this factor doesn't actually apply in the US. But it does apply in Japan, it does apply in Europe, and it certainly applies in Eastern Europe. And what's important there is that old people don't spend much. Their average spending is about 25% less than the average person, and as they get older, they spend even less. They actually begin to save more. So again, we'll see consumption spending being driven down by aging populations. And the final factor in the bottom left-hand corner is climate change, which I'll talk about in a second in more detail. But specifically, what's going to affect climate change is the effects of spending on repairs. We saw all sorts of events in the last few years of floods, of droughts, of fires, and governments are having to spend more money. The Dutch government is currently spending a lot of money to try and build new flood defences. The British government is now going to have to spend a lot of money to drain rivers, to stop flooding. We've seen all sorts of effects in southern France and in northern Italy from too much rain in the last few months. Governments are going to have to divert money into preparing for the effects of climate change, and that money is going to have to come from somewhere. It's not going to come from the private sector. It's going to come from individuals like you and me who will have to pay more taxes so that governments can spend on climate change protection. And so the main part of the economy will suffer as a result of that, progressively. So economic growth is going to remain weak. The fundamental pillar of the developed world's economic situation is going to remain weak for the next decade at least. The second issue I want to address is climate change itself. There's a lot of talk about this not being real. I was asked when I arrived whether or not it was actually man-made. It is absolutely real and it is absolutely man-made, and there is no question that we have a serious problem here. 99% of all scientists agree that we have an issue here, and if 99 out of every 100 doctors told you you had cancer, you would sit up and listen. But somehow people have been fed by a lot of talk that this is not real. It is absolutely real. And you can see some of the effects of this here. This is a chart from Munich Re, an insurance company in Germany, and it shows the trend for natural disasters. The little orange line along the bottom is the geophysical trends, so that's earthquakes and so on, which you can see have remained reasonably steady. The green bar is meteorological events, and you can see from 1980 through to 2011 that they have increased dramatically. The blue bar is hydrological events, so that's floods and mass movements, so landslides, and you can see that that's also increased dramatically. And then the orange bar at the top is climatological events, so that's extreme temperatures, droughts, and so on. And you can again see that the increase has been dramatic. And you can see also, if you look at the curve, that the trend is upwards. Why is that important? It's important if you're in the property sector because it's going to affect maintenance and repairs. I used to live in Hong Kong, as I said earlier on. Buildings there suffer from the humidity, they suffer from the extremes of heat, they suffer from the rain, and they have shorter lives on average than buildings in Europe. And we're going to see more of these problems occurring in other parts of the world. Just to give you a snapshot of what's going on here, I was in Australia last year, and I got this chart out of a newspaper there. In 90 days in Australia, 123 records were broken, and you can see flood records, fire records, drought records. When they talk about these records being broken and that the extremes are greater than they've been for 100 years, what they're not saying is that 100 years ago there was something worse. What they're saying is that we've been measuring this for 100 years and we have never seen anything like this in that time. So we're seeing an upward trend in terms of climate change, and we're seeing events like the typhoon in the Philippines. We're seeing things like Hurricane Sandy, and those events are going to increase, and that if you're investing in property in the long term, this would be my #1 issue to be concerned about. Are you going to be able to protect yourself against the changes that are coming? Finally, the issue I want to talk about, just to kick things off, is what we've called the next machine age. There's a study which I'll show you some of the results of in a second, which has been done by Oxford University and was published at the end of last year. And the capabilities that we've got in terms of mechanization, in terms of computerization, in terms of robotization, is about to take off. We're seeing all sorts of jobs which are vulnerable. And this study shows that over the next 20 years, 47% of today's jobs are vulnerable to being mechanized or partly mechanized, and so eradicated by machines. I checked in for my flight in Australia, coming out of Australia at the end of last year, I, of course, checked in online. I got my boarding pass, and then I went to the airport. I didn't see anybody before I got on the plane. I was able to check in my old bags completely by myself. So the entire process there had suddenly been mechanized. We're seeing Google has developed a car which is self-driving a decade ahead of when most technologists believed it was possible. So we're seeing this big wave of new technology coming through, and it's going to change what we do, and it's going to change the demand that we have for many buildings. Let me just give you a snapshot of what's involved here. This study, by the way, you can download the results, and at the end of it, it's a rather dry study, but there are 702 jobs listed about their vulnerability to change in the next 20 years. I'm just going to show you three, those that have a high likelihood of redundancy, those that have a medium likelihood of redundancy, and those that have a low likelihood of redundancy. So starting those that are high, telemarketeers, well, they can be replaced by computers pretty easily. Insurance underwriters, insurance claims clerks, credit analysts. Perhaps a surprise, 94% of auditors and accountants are vulnerable to being made redundant, that their jobs will be able to be done by machines automatically. And a lot of buildings house a lot of auditors and accountants. Legal assistants, a lot of the work done by junior lawyers can be mechanized today, can be done by computers. And that trend will increase. But look further down, waiters and waitresses, couriers and messengers, retail assistants, the people that work in shops, there's a 92% chance that their jobs will be eradicated in the next 20 years by machines. Look further down at the list of jobs which are medium chance of being made redundant, and you can see other jobs which are perhaps a little bit surprising. Maids and house cleaners, towards the middle, bus drivers, transit and intercity bus drivers. That it'll be possible, because of technology like Google, to eradicate a lot of the driving that's required, particularly in the public sector, before we start doing them in cars. Librarians, personal financial advisors, commercial pilots. We've seen that drones have been able to develop the technology very carefully that we don't need to have pilots any longer. So the sorts of jobs that we'll be doing in 20 years will change fundamentally. What sort of jobs are going to be safe? What sort of positions are likely to be retained? Well, they're jobs that require physical presence, that require caring, that require dexterity and creativity. Kindergarten teachers are pretty safe. It's very difficult to robotize those. Hairdressers, animal trainers, police officers, fitness trainers, editors, Michael will be happy to hear that. Lawyers, makeup artists, and choreographers have the very least chance of being turned into robots in the next 20 years. Now, I mention this because it is fundamentally going to affect the sorts of buildings that are required and going to fundamentally affect the types of people that are in them. And that if you're planning a building for the next 20 years, then you don't want to fill it with accountants and auditors, you want to fill it with something which is going to retain. So I say again, have a look at the complete list if you're interested in this. It's all available online, all 702 jobs, and you can find out whether or not your job is vulnerable too. What does all this mean for the property sector to me? Well, I guess there's really 4 lessons. First of all, planning is going to become more complex than it has been before. We've lived in an era of 30 years where there's been pretty steady economic growth and where the trend lines have been pretty clear. We're going to move into a period where there'll be much more volatility. Volatility in terms of economic prospects, volatility in terms of climate change and environmental effects, and volatility in terms of what buildings are used for. Because of climate change, we're going to see higher insurance and repair costs, and more vulnerability to climatic events, which you're going to have to build in to the designs and plans that you put together. Growth long-term will become harder to achieve in the developed world. That's not the case in places like China, Russia, Africa, Southeast Asia, South America. But in the developed world, sustaining long-term growth will become more difficult. And because of these job changes, I think there will be major changes in building use, and those need to be built into your plans as well. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Graeme, and that really does set us up with some of the important issues that we're going to be talking about today. But because, as I mentioned, we're in 25th anniversary territory, perhaps I can start off by asking our panel what they remember of life, business life, and the property world 25 years ago. So we're talking about 1989. How were things then? How were they different? What was most striking about that time? Perhaps, Robert, if we could start with you.
Sure. It was interesting when we had the pre-panel discussion. I asked Harry, I said, do you remember what interest rates were in 1989? And they were double digit. So I think we dealt in a world where the cost of money and its impact on the real estate market back then, 25 years ago, was hugely different than the environment now where money's almost free. And I think a second big trend that's happened over the last 25 years is that how internationalized the real estate industry has become around the globe. So when you look at cross-border capital flows, they're immense today, whereas real estate was still a largely localized business 25 years ago. And I think for a lot of people in the property profession today who weren't around 25 years ago, they probably don't have that mindset of how the cost of capital can change and what an impact it can have on your business.
Thank you. Harry, so interest rates, internationalization of the property world, how else were things very different, or weren't they different 25 years ago?
In 90 and 91, Manhattan, New York, faced a financial crisis, and the banks had withdrawn from the capital markets. The foreclosures were very high. Everybody was playing quite defensive, and the mantra at that time was stay alive till 95. So our industry tried to do everything we possibly could to placate the banks and to work with them. But there was more a matter of, in our sector, and I think all of those people involved in real estate understand how it can happen. Supplies can be increased dramatically if there's a tremendous inflow of capital. And in New York City particularly, the Japanese came into the marketplace. They bought Rockefeller Center. They were offering tremendous amounts of financing, very generous terms, long-term credit. Many of the institutions in Japan were no longer in existence as a result of the crisis in the 90s. Interesting thing, though, about our real estate industry, and it's not just not American-centric, it's really real estate-centric, the tremendous amount of resiliency that our markets have, and the imagination of the people in our industry to be able to work on that. I think Robert and I were talking about, we've all gone through crises before, and the ability to have good property, something good always happens to good property. Something good happens to patient money. Something good happens to superior design. So if the fundamentals are correct and you have the ability to stay with your projects, then of course that's really real estate, and that's been the story from the time of the caveman to now. I think what's really interesting about Martin's presentation is he's saying, hey guys, we should look and see how the world is going to be changing and where will be the job eliminations, and then how is that going to affect us. My response, I think these statistics are remarkable. My response is, it's really very difficult to be able to project so far. We've seen the electronic technology revolution, and in that 25-year period, the world has gone perhaps 500 years ahead in being able to transmit money, being able to send your floor plans where it used to be hard copy and there was actually ammonia in the printing. Now I can have a full set of construction documents on my BlackBerry. That's rather remarkable, and I can transmit it to anybody in this audience who has a smartphone, and everybody does. It's remarkable to see that growth. It's also very interesting for me, because I guess I'm probably the senior here, to see a little bit of a reversal to see the technology and the blogs and the web, and now to see printed media starting to come back. I'm sure you guys, Financial Times, have made your paper extraordinarily relevant in the past 10 years. And you're now not just a paper, you're a video, you're a whole conundrum of references to call upon. But yet, the circulation is not diminishing, and in several segments, especially architecture and design, people want to have a piece of paper. They want to have hard copy. It's wonderful for the Kindle, but people still want to read a book. So it's interesting to see the push and the pull of this. Certainly we face challenging and wonderful times, and that's it just for now. To you, Carlo.
Thank you very much, Harry. And Carlo, if you could just maybe pick up that point. I mean, Harry was saying well, many interesting things, but two of them struck me in particular. Patient money, good design, enduring values, these continue, and yet the world changes 500 years worth in 25 years. Going back 25 years, what do you remember about how things were? And perhaps you can also talk about your experience in architecture, in education. How were things different then?
Yeah, so, well, the first thing I say, 25 years ago, I was not in this business. If I were in Cannes here, at the time I was a teenager, I would come to Cannes to swim. But actually, I think, you know, I couldn't agree more to what was just said, actually. If you look back at the past 25 years, it's almost like 500 years. Think about how you could live today if we didn't have, you know, if we didn't have online connectivity, if we didn't have email. You know, when we go for 1 hour, we don't have email, we cannot even work. You know, think about how much things have changed. You just said internet, you can say World Wide Web started 25 years ago. We didn't have cell phones, we were not online. So I think that is the most striking thing. And to me, that has a huge effect on real estate. If you think about how our offices are organized, you know, the offices that were built 25 years ago were totally different than actually what we build today. Because the way we live today is very different, completely different than what it was 25 years ago. Now, then, I think the important thing is, you know, how can you look ahead, which is, I think, the theme of the topic, or the panel. I think it's going to be very difficult with this pace of change to look very far away. Probably we can do what Bucky Fuller was saying, anticipatory design, trying to design and experiment things that are about to come and try to see, you know, one step at a time. And the other thing I think that's very important is exactly what you said, that actually, however, there's something quite exciting about architecture. So our life is changing so fast, and yet some of us are still living in cities that were built by Romans 2,000 years ago. So in a certain sense, some of the things of architecture actually are the things that are really the opposite of our life changing. Architecture is also the values that are staying. There is almost as an antidote to actually this extreme pace of change in our life, and is actually creating spaces that in the end still need the same things, need horizontal floors, need facades to protect us from the outside environment. It needs, you know, good environmental condition and beautiful spaces and proportions.
Graeme, thank you very much, Carl. Let me pick up some of these things and put a question to you. If I think back 25 years ago, and unlike Carlo, I was not a teenager then, two things I can think I remember very well. First of all, and Harry alluded to this, young people weren't told, go and learn Chinese. China is the future. My column in the FT today is about children learning Chinese. 25 years ago, everybody was told, Japan is the country of the future. Go and learn Japanese. That's what you need to do. The internet, I don't think I'd heard of it at that point. I remember at that time, or even a little later, I remember talking to people in the music business. Their main concern at that time, what they were most worried about, was digital radio. And they thought that people were going to be broadcasting digital songs, and people would record them on digital blank discs, and that would undermine the music business. I mean, we had no idea what the world was going to be 25 years later. Is there any point to extrapolating in the way that your study of jobs did? How much can we know when we think that 25 years ago we could never have predicted where we are now?
It's a very good question. There are some things we simply cannot predict. I mean, a lot of the things you've mentioned are very difficult. And there are some things that endure, and there are some aspects of life which do follow very long-term trends, and they're driven by demographics as much as anything else. But also, I think the comments that were made here about enduring design, enduring quality, is going to be something which is going to endure. But if you look over the long term, you can see population, for example. In 1960, there were 3 billion people in the world. In 1989, there were 4.5 billion. Today, there are 7.2 billion. But that trend, unless there's some sort of major crisis or famine or disease, will continue. So we know that the number of people in the world will increase. We know over the long term that the rate of economic growth will trend downwards in the world, because that's driven by all sorts of factors that I talked about briefly. We know that the level of technology and what we can do with technology will increase. We can't say what those will be. We can't say what the new business opportunities which emerge will be. We can't say the new industries. We can't identify what those are. But we can see the general trend and direction. I was recently made a member of the Club of Rome. Now, the Club of Rome is very famous for a report in 1972 called Limits to Growth, which was done by MIT. And it looked at 100 years, actually looked at 200 years, from 1900 to 2010, and made predictions based on population, in terms of resources, in terms of pollution, in terms of economic output. And it had 12 scenarios, 6 positive, 6 less positive. And today, 40 years on, what we predicted in 1972 is exactly what's happened. Not a little bit, it's exactly. So you can look at very long-term trends, and you can see what's happening in the world, and you can make predictions based on that. So there are fundamental foundations which don't change. It's the noise around which changes very quickly.
Thank you, Graeme. Let's also think about what you've regarded, all of you, as the most important factor in adapting to what's happened in the past 25 years. What single characteristic, what single mode of behavior has stood you in good stead as you've adapted for the past 25 years and its changes? Robert, if I can start with you, what's been the most important adaptation you've had to make?
Well, I think you always have to be very open-minded in our business, and I think in the industry that we're in, you have to have absolute passion and a commitment to do something special. And I think if you always have that focus, it goes to the previous comments about quality and investing in design. So when we build these urban experiences, you have to be very, very passionate about wanting to do a good job. And you have to be very open-minded to change, because I think one of the key things in our industry is it's constantly changing, whether it's the retail environment, the hotel environment, the design of our consumers. So having a strong, passionate element to your business will give you some key success factors going forward.
Harry?
Looking kind of back a little bit, certainly helps looking forward. Looking back in the short term, especially in technology, which you're all aware of, there wasn't a company called Google or Twitter or half a dozen of these new spectacular companies which really now form what we call social media and the way to transport information. And that's what we see on the social side. What we also are seeing, and it comes back to real estate, is on the electronic technology side, we are able to transmit the information that we use, which used to be extraordinarily complex. Now it's even more so, but we're able to do that more efficiently. You're able to send through dinosaur and wire diagrams all of your interior elevations. You're able to speculate what the exterior and how that flow of traffic is going to be. We're able to really virtually understand, build our cities ourselves in the development community, whether it's design, architecture, passion, or even the construction manager, and be able to hold that in our hand long before we take the first shovel of excavation and foundation. Now, look at what a tribute that is to technology, and look at what fabulous tools we on the development, on the urban planning, on the architecture side have. That gives us an extraordinary ability. Hopefully, we handle the awesome responsibilities well, and we come up with a good design. That doesn't necessarily mean that we do, because we have the technology. We have the tools to do that.
So what's the greatest adaptation? Well, is it using those tools?
It's there, and it's also 3D printing. It's a whole new world that is available to us for our product production, for our fantasizing, from our imagination, from the fecund and fertile imagination that we have. We are able, this man is able to draw a high heel shoe and have it manufactured in 6 hours in a printer that is spitting out resin, and he's able to hold this up to Mr. Armani and say, do you like this? Now that's extraordinary. And that is part of the technology, able to do that with aortas, with hearts, with valves, with medical products. You can just ceaselessly end up with where this is going. So our buildings, of course, have to adapt to that. The ceilings have to be higher. The air conditioning has to be better. The air has to change constantly. We have to recognize that people are interested in a quality of life because we are changing the quality of life.
Carlo, I can see you're very eager to tell us what you think the key to adaptability is.
No, first I want to say I've never done a high heel shoe, designed a high heel shoe. You know, it might be interesting, a word that, as we heard before, is going to be tomorrow a word mostly of makeup artists and editors, you know, maybe similar categories, I don't know. But I want to say challenge first, started by challenging something that we just heard. You know, I think it's easy to predict some things. If you wanted to predict how many people will retire in 40 years, you know it exactly, because you know it today, you know the population. So it's very easy to predict population. And those variables are the variables that you find in some of the reports, in the 71 reports from the Club of Rome. But it's much more difficult to predict some of the things we just heard about, some of the great things about what happened. You know, nobody predicted Google or Twitter or many of the other things we just heard about. Actually, you might know that the Boston Globe in 1901 or 1900 actually ran an article about how life will be 100 years from them. So that was 2000. And if you look at that, you see that no prediction was actually correct. You know, they were thinking about this world of moving walkways and flying cars and many other things, you know, those things that we all saw in movies like Metropolis. I mean, none of that materialized. So I think the first thing I want to say is that my prediction is that you cannot predict. You cannot predict because there's so many, we cannot predict even a hurricane just a few days from now. So how can we think that we can predict something 25 years from now? So what can we do? And what is the lesson for adaptation, what you were saying? I think it is a little bit, mentioned it before, you know, what Buckminster Fuller used to call anticipatory design. So how can we do it? We can actually try to see the present trends and estimate one more step and see how can we try to experiment with it. It's about what Alan Kay used to say, you know, it's not about predicting the future. You don't predict it, you try to invent it.
Harry, I'd like to come straight back to you, because we were talking backstage before we came in about this enormously high building that you are building on Park Avenue. And you were saying, if we think back to the Empire State Building, that is a century ago, and it's still standing, it's still serviceable. You have to be able to think 100 years ahead when you build a building. What are you doing differently from what they did when they built the Empire State Building?
I'm taking 4 years to build it. They built it in a year and a half. That's quite different. We're building the tallest building, and you know I've said, well, I guess we should get an award for that. That's not something that we really planned on. It just happened to be a function of zoning and how much land we owned in Manhattan and how we had sized the floor so that we would have this rather pure form. And I think I was talking a little bit about it, the purity in architecture of a square. It's very difficult to screw that up if you continue a square as a square. So I'm sure Carlo will support that. But what we're doing is we're planning a building with as many of the modern amenities, and we're thinking in terms of, we live in a very, very challenging economic world. As a developer and as an investor, I've kind of made my investments and my focus in one area of the market, the very upper level, what I would call the top, the luxury level. Understanding that it's not simply a matter of riches when you sell these apartments. It's really a matter of what, in my mind, my opinion, what is that buyer, or what is this segment of buyers contributing to our economy, and then how does that filter down? Because surely when I sell an apartment for $8,000 or $10,000 a foot in New York, a figure of $25, $35, $40, or $50 million, for us it's very profitable. But what really happens to that money? And then what is that support system that goes into maintaining that building, maintaining that lifestyle, and how does that translate into dollars, into the city, and then into the economy? Because I think around the world now, especially in France, in New York City, in Spain, there's a political, what we would call a populist movement. We in our development community are not very happy about the mayor in New York, because we had a wonderful mayor for 12 years who nurtured the city, was very good. Bloomberg, he was not a politician, he was a businessman, and New York City flourished. Hotels were filled, the economy was wonderful, and generally New York City was a very, and continues to be a very desirable place to live. So the populist society is something that, while it's called for now, and we see it happening in France, we see it happening throughout Europe, how is that going to help our growth factors? How is that going to conflict with the upper level, and where does that leave us in the business? Also, many people say, well, is there that much of a market depth where you're able to build 3 or 4 or 5 buildings and generate the billions of dollars of sales that both Mr. Booth and I are enjoying?
Thank you very much, Harry. And that question of the divide and the possible divide between rich and poor, between young and old, is something I'd like to come back to in a little while. But while we're just on this question of how buildings have to be built nowadays, Robert, you're in a part of the world which is very energy hungry, needs a lot of cooling, obviously. How are buildings being built differently these days from how they might have been in previous generations?
Well, we find a big trend that we see increasingly, and I think it's driven just kind of by the way consumers are living. Just so much more is mixed use these days, and single as opposed to kind of single asset class. And when you get into these mixed use environments, you have to really then look at design. And it doesn't matter if it's shading elements in courtyards. We have a huge challenge building in the Middle East, just as you mentioned, just because of the climate. And that impacts your decisions on material selection, building operating systems. And then when you interlay these complicated mixed-use schemes, we have a shopping mall in Dubai that's called the Dubai Mall. It's got 1,200 retail tenants. We've got hotels attached to it, and we have over 200 F&B outlets in a shopping mall. And so all of these items, and then you start thinking about the air handling units to deal with that in a closed environment. And so you have to pay a huge amount of attention to your design these days, and you have to have the philosophy that you want to invest in good design.
Right, let's open things up to a bit of discussion now. If you have a question for any of the panels, if you could, panelists, if you could raise your hand, and a microphone will come to you, and I then ask you just to tell us who you are and what you represent, and if we could, for the moment, stick to questions rather than any speeches that there might be. Are there any questions from the audience? If you could just raise your hand. Anything? Any questions? Yes, there's one in the middle over here.
Hi, thank you very much. Very interesting. Ben Elder from the RICS. I just wondered whether there are any thoughts about the political boundaries. We've talked about the economic boundaries, but how have the political boundaries going to have to change to accommodate the business that we're all doing?
Just expand on that a little more, what you mean by political boundaries.
Well, we get a lot of influence from the EU. The US is finding pressures around its borders. The money is moving around the globe very, very rapidly, and the politics aren't following suit.
Okay, so the question is, we've had a globalized property business, globalized banking business, but we're not really seeing a globalized political system. We are seeing border disputes, we're seeing international disputes, we're seeing them in Ukraine and Crimea at the moment. Graeme, perhaps if I can start with you.
This is a very, very difficult area, because we're seeing a situation where I think our faith in a lot of what the democratic processes are breaking down. We're seeing a situation where we need global governance for a number of issues, particularly climate change, but we need global governance for lots of other issues as well. Internet security is one that springs to mind. And we're not seeing that, and there is no mechanism for those political institutions to step up to. The UN is clearly not up to it, neither is the World Bank or the IMF. So we have this need for global governance, and we have at the same time a lot of regional governance and national governance failing. If you look at the US, I mean, the Congress really is not fit for purpose any longer. It can't even pass simple pieces of legislation, and yet we're asking it to pass complicated pieces of legislation. So we have this gap, this political gap, I think, where we're all being told that we're living in democratic countries and we're not. And the gap is being taken over by big corporations, which are moving in, and they are driving a lot of the agenda. And I guess the question that I have is, how is that going to evolve over the next 20 years? And it's not clear. It's not clear to me at all that the national institutions, that the government institutions can pick up the mantle and begin to take on some of the issues which are of global importance. It looks more to me, particularly when I look at some of the free trade agreements that are in the pipeline, that the corporates will take over more and more of what's happening. And that presumably is in the benefits of the minority, and certainly in the benefits of industries like the property sector. The big issue for me that will determine the answer to that is what's happening in terms of grassroots politics. If you look at the rise of the right, particularly in Europe, in France, in Sweden, in Greece, and many other parts of the world, there is a growing discontent. And where that goes and what that leads to, I think, will determine whether or not there is a voice. The other factor, I think, is going to be climate change. If people begin to get seriously upset about climate change, then we'll see stronger national governments. But in the current trend is actually for weaker national governments and stronger corporate governance.
Carlo.
Yeah, but I was recently given a presentation at a conference called Metropolis, with the mayors from many different cities from all over the world. And I was thinking, this almost looks like, here are the mayors, but it almost looks like a conference with heads of state. And actually, when you look at our planet from space, what you see cities. You see actually this great invention of humanity. It wasn't there 7,000 years ago, but actually what brings us together, living together in space. But you don't see national borders. And I think what we are seeing is more and more actually cities playing a more and more active role. We see it actually here at MIPIM in all of the stands and a lot of the discussions going on. And we also see the other level that's becoming more and more important is the level beyond the national level, be it the EU, be it the global level, and so on, that's getting more important. And it seems to me that the intermediate levels are kind of dissolving and disappearing little by little. So really, I think the urban scale, the scale of the city, which is then also this competition between cities to attract talent, is what is going to be more and more important. So from the political point of view, I think the mayor's level is what is going to drive a lot of decisions, especially in the fields and we're discussing here today.
Harry, I was very interested to note, when you talked about the politics that have an effect on your business, you talked about it at the mayoral level, specifically, as Carlo said. Do you agree with that? Mayors and city leaders are becoming more important than national governments?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. I think that throughout the world, we're seeing a tremendous failure in the leaders of the national government. That's the crisis that we've seen in Europe, the irresponsible and profligate spending throughout Greece and throughout Europe. That's terrible. That's at a political level. And all of us are aware, and there's no controversy in this, that the city growth will continue, that the urban environment will totally tend to suck up the suburban environment, and your cities will grow larger and larger and larger. You'll have to do your planning in your malls. You'll have to do remarkable thinking in order to stay apace with the population demand. Just your 200 food and beverage outlets in your mall, taking their refuse out and where you put that and what you accumulate. But I want to offer something that's a little bit of a, perhaps it should have been in the earlier part, but I just thought, I thought I'd mention it because I can't talk at home. So I thought that it's really interesting because of this instrument that we all have. And I was in Cupertino when Steve Jobs made the presentation of the first iPhone. And it was a spectacular presentation. It was awesome. He pranced up and down the stage like this. He was the only person on the stage for an hour and a half with a phone that they had finished the night before, that they kept their fingers would cross that it would actually work, and it did, and the presentation was spectacular. And it is truly the revolution. It's the revolution that's changed all of our life. And I think that revolution is going to continue, and I wanted to mention this. I believe that this telephone is going to become our bank. I believe it's become our computer. I believe that electronic transmission of money, buying and paying, is all going to be through this phone. I believe that perhaps Apple will buy one of the credit pay companies, whether it's MasterCharge or Bank of America or Eurocharge, and why not? It certainly makes sense. They have the capacity, and it's consistent with moving forward. These are things that you can't predict, but you certainly can speculate about. So the ever-changing world, both in the real estate, in the electronics, all of this is related. We get our rents paid to us electronically. We disperse our payments electronically. When I started in the business, I had a 5-day bank holiday when I could say, yes, I sent the check. You can't do that anymore. Yes, I wired the money. Well, give me the Federal Express number.
Thank you.
I pass this on.
So, Robert, I mean, as Harry said, it's companies that are basically moving through borders, making borders irrelevant, and yet governments aren't keeping up. How do you see it from the part of the world that you work in?
Well, clearly this idea of cities as the future, we're entered the century of the city. And the notion that we live increasingly in an urban world is what we see in our business day to day. So today, about half the population lives in cities, but by 2050, they estimate 70% of people will be living in cities. So it doesn't matter if you're a new gateway city like Dubai and you're growing at a very fast rate, or some of the mega cities that are around the world like Lagos, like Mumbai. So increasingly, this issue of mayors is a big issue because the issues that we deal with day to day, getting our water, having our trash dealt with, is all at a civic level. And you look at some of the urban thinkers today, Bruce Katz of the Brookings Institute is talking about a metropolitan revolution in the United States. Even Benjamin Barker's new book where he talks about why mayors should rule the world. And it's going to be a trend that continues how important cities are to what we do. And for our business organization, we really look at the big growth that's happening in a lot of these cities and is in a lot of the emerging markets. This is where we really try and focus our business because the growth rates there are so high. And you get away from the challenges of Europe where you've got a very slow growth mode, or the United States where you've got a very slow growth mode. A lot of these economies are growing at 5, 6, 7, 8%. So you look at a country like Baghdad and you say a country like Iraq and a city like Baghdad, do you want to do business there? Well, it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and it has shortages of everything. So we look at these frontier markets where the industry is 25, 50 years behind the Western world, but there's huge demand with the growing consumer class in all these cities.
Right. Any more questions? Yes, I can see a hand up in the middle there.
Good morning. My name is Asan Rashid, the CEO of DDG. We are a global design consultancy firm from US. Very interesting ideas and thoughts I'm hearing. I mean, I go through a lot of session and a lot of reading, and what I'm hearing today is really about the past and what everybody thinks from their thinking what could be there. I mean, I remember in early 2000 that when the internet came in really in big power, people were saying the demise of the shopping centers because everything is going to be e-commerce, and what happened? Nothing happened, except it went opposite. We're seeing Amazon is everywhere, but Amazon is a fraction of the world economy on electronic commerce, and Walmart is still the biggest retailer in the world. And Amazon is adapting the brick and mortar and building the warehouses so they can do online economics but deliver the same day. So what I'm trying to get the panel's thought about, like one comment came in about what jobs could be replaced. The point is, one factor which we all forget is the human interaction. People love to touch, feel, smell, and be with each other, and that's why we are still humans and not being replaced by the machines. And that factor is what challenges the future, and the company like Facebook has 10 billion subscribers and friends all over, and companies like Facebook are changing the world's politics, and the Twitters of the world are writing the future across the political boundaries. So my question is, not to make it into a speech, is what does panel think? Because whatever predictions which major companies are doing is what we know today, and we can think we don't have a crystal ball, but human interaction is something which trumps everything every 5 years, every decade, every 2 decades, because people are the most unpredictable part of this puzzle. And as the old saying goes, if you talk about a Google car, they said, if you take the humans out of the driving, then you will have the safest streets in the world. It's the human who kills everything, and is the people with the ever-changing mind. So in this big debate, what we are having, and discussion we are having, where does everybody see that, I brought in the example of, you know, the shopping center industry demise, which everybody predicted. Nothing happened except the shopping centers are growing more than ever. People were always looking into a trend, but forgetting the biggest part, the unpredictability of humans.
Thank you. That's a very, very significant question. And I think we can add to this events that we are seeing here and all these people absolutely thronging through town should not have happened. People said, we're all going to be video conferencing. We don't need to come to big international conferences. And yet humans persist in defying all of these supposed trends. Graeme, if we can start with you.
No, absolutely. This is a very, very important question. And I remember in the late 1990s, I was writing for part of The Economist, and I was writing about the internet revolution. And everybody was saying, it's going to change everything. We're going to lose all our shopping centers, just as you said. And I was writing, no, it's not. Not yet. And I think the question is one of timing. The internet computing has the capacity to replace lots of boring, uninteresting, tedious jobs. It has the potential to replace, we've seen it replacing much of the banking that we do. If you buy a book, then certainly in much of the world you go to Amazon to buy it. You don't go to a bookstore anymore. You can look around buildings before you buy them online. You can do a lot more online than you could before. And that trend will continue. So I think what everybody got wrong in the late 1990s was the timing. They said, my God, this revolution's coming, and they were right. But they expected it to come in 2 years, whereas it will take 20. But there's no question that we can replace a lot of what we're doing today with machines. Now, one of the things that started recently is online education, where you can go online to university and take a course. And thousands have signed up, and it hasn't really worked. But it will work because it's so much cheaper. And that's what will drive the change. When it's so much cheaper and so much more cost effective, then that will drive the replacement of human jobs with machines. Now, I agree with you completely. The ones that will be left are the ones where human beings are needed, where we cannot be replaced, where it's about caring, working in hospitals, or caring, working in old people's homes, or bringing up children. Those are the jobs which are going to count. And the big question for me as an economist is, where is the balance there? How do we find a position where we see this trend towards technology replacing work, and we have human beings who need work, and they need the work to spend, to buy the apartments, to keep the economy functioning. And we have this big problem. And to me, the biggest concern I have for economies of the developed world right now is not economic growth, but is jobs. How are we going to be able to maintain jobs so that the human part of the world that actually drives everything can remain sufficiently in place?
Sorry, Graeme, if I can just challenge you a little bit more on that, because I think what our question was pointing to was the need for humans to be with each other. Now, you're saying, yes, the shopping malls haven't disappeared, but they will. And yet what we're seeing, you know, bookstores haven't completely disappeared, but they're going. And yet we're seeing something else. Yes, people are buying books over Amazon or reading them on their Kindles, but they're also thronging in their tens of thousands to literary festivals. They want to hear the authors speak. Same thing is happening to music. I mean, to me, Spotify is one of the greatest innovations of the internet age, the ability to listen to whatever music you want when you want it. And yet concerts are still massively popular. You have to pay lots of money to get a ticket for them. Humans like to be with each other. It's not just about jobs.
No, I agree completely. I mean, the shopping centre, if shopping centre is an entertainment, it's a place to go, and it's become a place to go rather than going to the golf course or whatever people used to do before. And as long as it retains that element, then people will continue to go there. But despite things like Spotify, you've seen music sales going down, you've seen book sales going down, you've seen the number of people who work at the front office of banks going down. You've seen an effect of this technology, and those trends will continue because it's cheaper, and it will be driven by economics. Now, if you can attract people into malls because you provide them with entertainment, then you can offset that. But the long-term trend will be driven by cost.
Okay, I think Harry and Carlo are really ready to talk. Why don't you go first?
Well, no, I think the gentleman. I think the gentleman before had the wrong premise, but the right answer. Let me tell you why. I think the wrong premise because, you know, that discussion doesn't make sense. You know, if you think about, people were thinking about the paperless office. And then for a number of years, actually, paper's consumption went up and up and up, and actually now it's disappearing. So I think it's saying that actually for a bit you get a different trend. It doesn't say that this is not going to happen. However, I think you touch upon an important point. I think the second point, which is, you know, technology allows us to do more things. Technology allows us to do things we couldn't do before. Yes, you know, at the beginning of the internet, people thought, you know, hey, you could go to the top of the Mount Everest and keep on working from there. You know, some people wrote, there's still writings from the mid-90s saying that actually cities would disappear. They will not be relevant anymore. And then the same people 10 years later say, well, you know, made a mistake. I mean, yes, technology would allow you to go to the top of Mount Everest and work from there, but why the hell would you want to do that? You want to be in a fun place. You want to be in Cannes. You want to be with other people. You want to be in an office. You actually want to exchange things with others. So I think the important thing is what you were saying as a conclusion is actually that, yes, technology gives us more opportunities, but then the drives behind, and, you know, those are always the same. They're the same that actually brought us together, starting in cities that didn't exist 10,000 years ago. You know, how humanity invented cities and brought us together to make sure that the total is more than the sum of our individual parts. You know, in those things about being together in sociable places with good environmental conditions, those things will still be there, even if technology will change.
Harry, I mean, you create spaces where people come together. How do you see this?
A few ways. As I pointed out, and I asked my colleagues to think about it, the audience to think about what we're illustrating, the technology has been an enormously helpful support in our businesses. It allows us to prepare our plans, look at a building, change a building, and make decisions, make informed decisions. Technology, it does it in every form of life that has to do with making products, providing services. I think technology, unfortunately, in email has a lot of drawbacks and has to be kind of looked at a little more carefully and cynically than all of the advances in business. I'm finding that technology, back and forth instant messaging in my office, loses that important touch, that discussion that allows you to get a better understanding on the human scale. I'm not a tremendous advocate of education on the internet. I think the idea is terrific, but I think the lack of discipline on the part of the student, the supplicant, the applicant is such that it's almost self-defeating. And I think that in this case, the learning process is something that is kind of energized, and it's a collaboration. You're working with your professor. You're working and you're getting the knowledge. You're bored or you're stimulated, and that's kind of a one-on-one. And I think that's a personal thing that's extremely important. On the overall, though, I think we all can see just extraordinary, fabulous future, things that we can't even imagine will make our life more comfortable. And where are the jobs going to come from? We're constantly creating jobs. Jobs are shifting. Perhaps it's not as easy for my generation to get a job, but it certainly is for half the audience. It's a much broader. And when I say adapting, our business is resilient, our people are resilient, our minds are resilient. And that's what is the only limiting factor.
Okay. Graeme wants to come back
in there. I mean, unfortunately, the facts are different. We are not creating jobs. We're not creating sufficient jobs. That for more than 20 years, unemployment has been trending upwards in the developed world. The average in the OECD countries is nearly 9% now. And in some parts of the world, Italy, Spain, Greece, you know, youth unemployment is above 50%. So we have a fundamental problem with jobs, and a lot of it is because technology has been replacing people. Now, I do agree there are all sorts of industries going to come along which will replace industries today, that will create all sorts of jobs, that will create all sorts of entrepreneurs, but I question whether or not sufficient Googles can replace entire industries which will be wiped out by the technology that comes along.
Well, I just very briefly, I think I would re-challenge it, because you know, when Pericles decided to build the Parthenon, actually one of the things he was actually facing was unemployment at the time in Athens at the time. And actually what we've seen all across human history is actually that actually new technologies came. Once upon a time we would all be growing tomatoes here. And then sometimes we outsource that, and wow, there's a big change. Actually, people will have to change and move to do other jobs. And I think, you know, what we are seeing today is probably a faster pace, and if there is a faster pace, transition becomes more difficult. But what we've seen this in the past, think about a huge change that went from going to almost 100% farming society to an industrial society, with all the different industrial revolution that we've seen till today. So the same thing, and people have written about the same things, about losing jobs, what's going to happen. The problem is the transition. Now, the different thing today is that the transition is happening faster and faster, but yes, I totally agree, you know, then humans actually are jumping into doing other things. And I personally think that if actually somebody doesn't need to spend all their lives at an industrial production chain and, you know, turning a bolt, and actually a computer can do that, and the person can think or do something more creative. I think there's something good for all of us and for all society.
Right, we've got a question right in the front here.
Bonjour. My name is Jean-Claude Goldenstein. I was here 25 years ago. I'm from France, but I'm an entrepreneur in New York, and I run an internet company at the intersection of mobile and social, but I'm a real estate guy. I was in consulting. I haven't heard in the last hour and 15 minutes now the word data, or data mining, or big data. And I have a villa here. We had about 25 people, some of the pioneers from about 20 countries, 20 professions. And I asked them the same question, and what they came up with is basically we had an explosion of cars, people, which you guys have talked about, apps on the iPhone, as Harry talked about. But if you look at the impact on the FT, for example, explosion of everybody as a publisher. Everybody's blogging, everybody's tweeting, and that creates a problem because when I go to Google or Twitter and I try to search for the future of cities or the future of hybrid shopping centers or the future of energy storage or anything like this, what I get is noise. And what you said is the megatrends stay, and what's really hard is to decipher the noise. And what helps with this is data mining. And what I'd like the panel to comment on is how do you, when you are at a MIPIM, for example, what is 2,000 exhibitors all saying they're great and all putting out press releases about everything they do and then tweeting it and blogging it, and how do you cut through the noise? And imagine now 25 years from now what the noise is going to be like, and how from your iPhone will you be able to deal with it?
It's an excellent question. There is data everywhere. We all think we can find the truth in that data, and there's a huge amount of noise around it. Perhaps we can start with you, Carlo.
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right. If you take, we all know that if you take all the data produced by humanity till 2003, actually that same amount of data is what we produce now every 24 to 48 hours. Now, in the first amount of data, you had Shakespeare, you had the Bible, you had, every other thing. We don't produce the same quality every day. There's not a Shakespeare every day, but actually the sheer volume is exactly the same. So that's a very fundamental change. I believe that the change is going to radically transform our cities. It is something that you could define, in technical jargon, is what you call a cyber-physical systems. What you're designing are cyber-physical systems that combine the digital side with the physical side. Now, the same thing that we've seen in many different disciplines over the past few decades, think about, Formula One. Used to be something where the car was important, and now it's something where the car is still important, but also all the telemetry, the data component, collecting data and responding to that. Well, what we've seen in many disciplines now is entering our buildings. Think about Nest and many other things about making our buildings smarter, is entering our cities. So this incredible convergence of digital and physical is producing a huge amount of data. Now the question then, are we drowning in data? It's a very good question, but it reminds me of the same thing that people said, say 15, 20 years ago about the internet. They say, there's so much noise, how can you actually find something? And then Google came and solved the problem. And I think what everybody's trying to do today is actually looking at, what's going to be the Google of big data in a certain sense. I mean, who's going to be able to get the value of the big data? And actually, how we're probably going to do it, not for all of the big data, because here it's not only about the digital per se, it's digital and physical. So how maybe the city of Cannes is going to find a new way to actually capitalize on the big data that's been generated in the city to run it more efficiently, how some of you may actually be developing the next app that will help to run an office development or a new development or a new neighborhood in a much more efficient way thanks to data. So I think that's a big challenge we have today.
Robert, how do you think that we can cut through all the data that there is to find what's useful?
Well, it's quite interesting. McKinsey's writing a lot these days in their global competitive department about big data and the impact it's going to have on the built form. And an organization like us, where we have, to speak about Dubai Mall again, we have 75 million visitors visit that attraction every year. And we count those visits with sensors. And when I was speaking to your colleagues at the MIT Media Lab, the advancements of digital and sensors and how we can start to collect big data about what our customers are doing as opposed to just counting them. I think it's going to evolution our business, and it's going to give us a lot of intelligence when we come back and design the built form to really understand better patterns of our consumers so we can design better spaces and create better buildings. And it was fascinating to learn that they think the advancements in sensors are getting so far ahead that when you walk into a building, they're going to almost be able to measure your health. Are you feeling well? Do you have a temperature? So then what do we do with this data? It's quite fascinating how it's going to impact our built form.
Okay, it's interesting, and I think people have picked it up, as Robert said, it's going to be able to measure our health. There's a lot of future promise in big data. Where do you think we are, Graeme?
I think this is a very, very interesting question. I think, if I think about the Euro crisis, for example, we've been surrounded by media telling us there's a crisis, there's a crisis, there's a crisis, whereas in fact there's not that big a crisis. The euro is extremely strong. There's absolutely no reason why any country would leave the eurozone. But we've been bombarded with this short-term data all the time. This is a particular example that you're talking about. And so the first thing that strikes me is take a break. Stop reading the news feeds all the time. Take a break for a few days every week and think. Think about what's going on. Think about what the fundamentals of what's going on really are. Think about Ukraine. What's really going on there? It's about a lot more than politics. And you can't do that if you're reading Twitter every 5 seconds. You have to have time to reflect. You have to step back from it. What happens all the time is bombarding you with information, and you have to have time to internalize that and reflect on it. The second thing, and you're saying you were a consultant, if you're going to look around what sort of all these great opportunities that are here, which ones should you pick up on? Set criteria. Define what you're looking for. You know, what sort of size of investment are you looking for? What sort of location? What sort of buildings are you looking for? Set clear criteria and look for those. Don't go in saying, well, I'm going to try and find something interesting. Define what you're looking for. And finally, I think, you know, despite all this data and 100,000 books on every subject which are available on Amazon, quality still counts. The thinking, the approach, and the character of what's being produced still counts, and you should still define it by that. So I think we are surrounded by this. It will get worse, but you just need to have some discipline to find your way through the maze.
Harry, your buildings must generate huge amounts of data for you. Do you use them? How do you find it useful?
Well, it's interesting. There were two things that I was going to say in response to my colleagues. First of all, I kind of feel like a Broadway producer or a movie producer. There is no bottom line, there is no net. If you remember that from one of the movies. In reality, certainly in today's world, there are two things that we as real estate people, and I want to try to bring it back to real estate for a moment. There are two things that we should really be thinking of. One, I think the first is that there is no truth. There's nothing that's absolute. And if you think about that, because the world is evolving so quickly, that certainly has to be reckoned with. Everything is changing so rapidly. And then on our side, on the sponsorship side, because we're the ones who are always gambling, we're the ones who are fantasizing, and we're the ones who are dreaming, I would say that does not kill me makes me stronger. So now we have two kind of strict dictums. There's no truth, and as you get on and as long as you're standing up, you're stronger. And then how does that interpret, how do you take that into our business in this, the second decade of the 21st century? You do it by having both a clairvoyance and understanding of what your population demands are, a really understanding of the market, and how to both distinguish your product, how to plan as best you possibly can in your own mind with your consultants the next 5 years, 10 years, the handling of the garbage, the in and out of your automobiles, the exchange of your visitors. One thing that all of us know here is the rapid advancement of vertical transportation. Today, the elevator companies are not building push-button elevators anymore. We're pushing smart elevators. The elevators are going to be hanging in the shaft, saving electricity, and they will go to where the demand is. And they'll do it in the most efficient way. So our challenge is, one, to build buildings, to be clairvoyant enough to build a building for which there is a demand, and to do it in such a way that it's very desirable, be it low income, middle income, or the high end, and to be able to think in terms of both the classic construction product constraints that you have, so that 10 and 20 and 30 years down the road, that building is timeless. So with the extraordinary world that we're going through, we're also facing these challenges on the physical and the planning side. And somebody asked me this morning, well, don't you want to retire? I said, no, of course not. Every day is so challenging. Every day is a new problem to be confronted, a new joy. And frankly, for my career in the business, if I didn't get paid for doing what I would be doing, I'd be doing it with the same enthusiasm that I do it today. And if somebody asked me for advice in a summation, there were two things that I would say. Bear in mind, as entrepreneurs, developers, brokers, bankers, or investors, that talk to yourself first, talk to yourself last, cull as much information as you can get, but you're the final decision maker, it's you. And if you think it's right, then it's right. If you're reticent, then it's wrong, then don't do it. But you're the person who makes that decision. And the next bit of advice I would say is, do not forget your telephone charger when you check out of the hotel.
Thank you very much, Harry. We're almost coming to the end, and Harry has brought us into what I would like to be our final question. Harry's already answered it, but let me ask the others. What advice would you give to young people going into the property business today? The advice could be, don't go into the property business, but if they do, what advice would it be? Robert, if I can ask you.
Twofold, and it relates to my previous comment. I think if you're going to be in this business, have a lot of passion, like Harry obviously has. I often joke with people in my office when I go to work every day, I say it's like playing sports. It's fun. It doesn't feel like work at all. And then I think secondly, look at some of these big macro trends around the world. And if we are entering this urban world, go and explore it and see where the opportunities are. It may take you out of your comfort zone, but seeing what's happening internationally will be a great benefit, and take advantage of those opportunities.
Carlo, advice to young people today. Property, yes or no, first of all?
Well, I have no idea. But what I would say is actually, you know, and I think what we're discussing today is actually an example of that. Here we're at MIPIM, and I think MIPIM 10 years ago, probably nobody would have been here discussing big data, IT, and all of this. So I think the first thing is actually you really need to look at the broader spectrum, exactly as you said. You really need to look beyond just, you know, the bricks. Yes, you know, cities of yesterdays were made of bricks, of concrete, of steel, of glass. We knew how to make them. Cities of tomorrow, buildings of tomorrow will be made of that and silicon, of concrete and silicon. How to marry that still remains to be seen. But I think if we want to be successful in tomorrow's world, we need to be able to understand the challenges in that space.
Graeme, let's come to you. And as you're not in the property world yourself, and you talked about the jobs that they're going to be, is this a good business to go into? What bit of it, and what should people bring to it?
It's working? Yeah. So from my experience of dealing with all sorts of different industries around the world, the property sector seems to be a particularly good one. It seems to be one where people can make a lot of money and sustainably over the very long period. So it seems to me to be a fundamentally healthy business. But I'm approaching this not as an expert or anybody who's in the sector, but it seems to me that I have a son of 21, I have a daughter of just leaving school. And what I say to them is that there's really three things they need. They need to be flexible. Flexible in their approach to the world, so that they're ready to change. The second thing, openness to embrace change. You need to be ready not just to watch it, but to embrace it. To be able to change with the world, because the world's going to be much more volatile and changeable in the time ahead compared to the past. And finally, having an international perspective. I think you have to have an international perspective, despite what you're saying about cities being vitally important. I think that's absolutely true. But you need to be able to see and understand what's happening in India, what's happening in China, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the US, and take a perspective then with that, that knowledge. So I think, you know, flexibility, embracing change, and an international perspective.
Thank you. I think we could have probably carried on talking for a long time, and apologies to those of you who still have questions, but that brings us to the end of our time. I'd like to ask you to join us in thanking our panelists, Graeme, Robert, Harry, and Carlo. And thank you to all of you for your attendance here today. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much.
Merci.
Grand merci a tutti.
Kamen. Danke. Toda.
Shukran.
Domo arigatou gozaimasu.
Muchas gracias.
Dhanyavad. Spasiba.
Thank you. Okunchran.
Mulțumesc.
Merci.
Merci.
Rahmat. Thank you.
Teşekkürler.
Akewa.
Thank you. Sahit. Shukran.
Merci.
Merci. Merci. Grazie.
Spasiba большое.
Dziękuję.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Dank u wel. Un grazie enorme.
Hartelijk bedankt.
Tak.
Merci.
All of us at REMIDEM thank you for your support for MIPIM over 2.5 decades. Now, let's enjoy the next 25 years.